Belief in the unseen is hard because the scene leaves scars. It danced like the stars. My ears went ring ring. Incoming message from Supreme Being. Then light covered my body. I'm drifting off. I have a heart attack probably. I'm lifting off. Beam me up into the cockpit swift and soft. I can't see the pilot. Man, it must be heaven. It feels like heaven. A real bright presence. Carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. I'm married to the throne. I'm carrying my cross with a crown full of thorns. Hosanna, Hosanna. 20 miles from Atlanta. Please rain down manna.
My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
And now, World War I veteran Sidney Williams.
Shall I say I'm still here? Still alive and kicking, I hope.
To exist. I mean, even trying to keep clean or trying to get something to eat. Or...
Trying to keep clean, because you're all smothered in lice. First you got rid of them, you got more on you. They used to breed on us. It just simply comes up to you and you might go for there for a good night's rest and that, and then you go, wake up with these memories and that.
Mr. Williams, was it all worth it?
No. I can never have me going involved, old enough, younger. You'll never get me again to volunteer, not me.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm your host, Mr. O'Mara, the host with the most, the MC that was meant to be. Every question you could have shall be answered today. In today's edition of the Year 10 Poetry Soundbites, we're gonna look at the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen. So you need to get that poem in front of you right now. You just heard a little snippet of an interview with a former veteran, Sidney Williams, and that's after the war. We're now going to go to before the war, and I want you to listen to the following song and tell me, does it offer a positive or negative impression of life as a soldier, of life in the war ahead? And then we'll talk about it. Over There, written by George M. Cohen, 1917. All rights reserved, much respect. Fade out the music, bring back the voice. So we have two different ideas. We have the veteran reflecting on the war that was, and soldiers looking ahead to the war that will be. And what we have is a clear contrast. A clear contrast between our expectations and the reality of war. And this is the starting point, and it's actually going to be the finishing point of this podcast as well. The idea of expectations of war versus realities of war. Expectations for a war poet and the realities for the war poet. Expectations for what a poem should look like and the realities of what we are given. So obviously we're connecting to context straight away, the key ideas. And what I'm going to say first about context is that we are dealing with conflict, and we are dealing with one of the most famous conflicts in history, World War I. 2 points on World War I that are essential to know for this poem. The first is Wilfred Owen was a soldier in the war. Joined in 1915, died in 1917. Died like literally 2 weeks before the war ended. And Wilfred Owen was one of many soldiers in the war who were educated and could read and write. Because of education reform in the 1870s, 1880s, soldiers were able to read and write, and they wrote letters home and they wrote descriptions of the war. And in this poem, Exposure, were given a description of life in a trench. The war itself was a brutal, horrible war to live, and the reason why doesn't really add up. So there's horrible living conditions, and just the threat of chemical attacks, bombs, machine guns, snipers, landmines, disease. You saw lice with what Sidney Williams was saying in the beginning, constant feelings of anxiety, and then just the freezing cold temperatures. But why? Like, why did the war happen? It's actually a very interesting question. It's not so simple. You might suspect that it was all Germany, but it wasn't. So a Serbian man called Gavrilo Princip shoots an Austrian man called Franz Ferdinand. And without going into too much more detail, because of the alliance systems, Great Britain found themselves in a war against Germany and France and Belgium. So we have two clear sides. So there's conflict in the poem with the fact that it's a major European conflict. The more important part I want to talk about is not the war, but it's the idea of exposing the war. So Wilfred Owen's exposing the lies of recruitment, and he's exposing the realities of the war. He's also talking about what the soldiers were exposed to. So he's exposing what they were exposed to. And what they were exposed to is, on one sense, the physical aspect, which is the living conditions and the weather conditions, freezing cold temperatures. But on the psychological aspect, we're talking about, the effects of being in a constant state of anxiety, constant state of tension, patiently waiting for war and combat to come, but it might never arrive. You might just have to deal with the cold. So these are the ideas that Wilfred Owen is trying to convey in the poem. We're going to read the poem, and we're going to talk about AO2 and how these ideas are explored through his use of language, structure and form. We're going to also link with a couple other ideas as well that I think are very important with AO2, but also with your analysis. So you need to now get the poem in front of you. You're also going to need to get a pen and paper to take notes and annotate as we get through our AO2 analysis. Okay, so you should have the poem in front of you right now. And I just want you to look out for the use of language techniques and see, can you identify how he's using structure in the rhyme scheme. Okay, so Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly the flickering gunnery rumbles. Far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? So in those first two stanzas, we got a lot we can kind of talk about. Some good quotes there. Merciless ice east winds that knife us. Lovely quote there that you can use war analysis for. But nothing happens at the end. It's an interesting anticlimactic end to the stanza. It builds up with emotive language, and then there's no resolution at the end. And the final line in the second stanza, what are we doing here? It kind of poses the question of, why is the war happening? Why is this occurring? And the answer never really is given in the poem. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. So we've, in the third and fourth stanza, we got some sibilance, we got some personification again, emotive language, and we have repetition of the refrain, but nothing happens, in the final line in each stanza. So that "but nothing happens" is now appearing 3 times, and it actually links to a Samuel Beckett poem, or Samuel Beckett play, where he talks about where nothing happens, nobody goes, nobody comes. And it links this idea of this anticlimactic finish to tension. So we build tension with beautiful language techniques, and it all arrives at the final line of a stanza, and it is the same as before. There's no resolution. Stanza 5. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glossed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. And it's the same idea again. We have a second rhetorical question in the poem. Is it that we are dying? It almost responds to the previous question of what are we doing here. It's like a question to respond to a question. Is it that we are dying? The final line in the next stanza, we turn back to our dying. So we look back on those that have died. And this final line, this refrain, it changes at times, but the same feeling of uncertainty, frustration, and the lack of resolution is consistent, which is interesting. Final 2 stanzas. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever sun smile true on child, or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us. Shrivelling mighty hands and puckering foreheads crisp, the burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. And we get to that final line in the poem, and it connects with our first stanza, where we have the same final line of the stanza, but nothing happens. So we've come to the end of the poem, and there's no true resolution. It's an interesting poem, and there's a lot you can talk about, but the first point I want to make, and it's linking back again to a previous idea I had of expectations versus reality. If I was to say to you, Wilfred Owen's going to write a World War I poem set in the trenches, it could be like Dulce et Decorum, where it's a gas attack, or it could be maybe another poem like Bayonet Charge, where it's dealing with the action. But here we're dealing with soldiers waiting and waiting for war, waiting for combat, waiting for what they expect, these harsh atrocities. But what arrives is harsh weather conditions. We get to the final line with that image of the burying party, so they're burying bodies, and you have shaking grasp, shriveling hands, and the half-known faces. Their eyes are ice. So it kind of gives the impression that what's killed them is actually the weather, is the freezing cold. So with AO2, we want to understand the message of the poem. Wilfred Owen's trying to create a message, and to improve how he conveys that message, he's going to use language structure and form to create the effect on the reader. And the effect he's trying to create. He's trying to have them feel empathy for the soldiers. Yes, absolutely. He wants the reader to question the war, question the reasoning behind the war. Yes. And he's just looking to expose the realities of the war and contrast them maybe with what we expect. He's looking to expose the conditions, expose the lies of recruitment, and he's going to do that through language, structure and form. With language, what I'll say first is we have a range of language techniques, and I could just list them off for you right now in the poem. You can go find them. Onomatopoeia, all over the place. Sensory images that evoke your sense of sight or sound, all throughout the poem. Sibilance, the hissing sound used to create a negative effect in the poem. We have personification of the weather throughout. We have pathetic fallacy, the weather used to convey the tone of the poem. We have emotive language throughout the poem to create tension and build our sense of how the weather is more dangerous than the bullets. So, for example, a lovely quote I would take is actually in the first stanza where it says, "Merciless ice east winds that knife us." You can talk about the personification, building of the weather conditions, talking about an actual issue, and then you can talk about knife us, and that's a powerful word. You know, it's like deliberate choice of words for an effect, using violent imagery and associating the weather with violence. And then mad gust tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles, a simile used to give the weather conditions a sense of kind of, it's unpredictable, it's mad gusts, and it's also then conveyed to the reader as if it's an attacking army, where it says, "Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army attacks in ranks on shivering ranks of grey." Gives the sense that what they expect are ranks of soldiers, but what they're getting is ranks of, rain, wind, storms, harsh weather conditions. And that kind of language, in a nutshell, you can identify techniques and then build it towards the effect that he's trying to get across here. With structure, we have a consistent structure in terms of our sentence structure and his use of sentence structure within his stanzas. From a stanza level structure point, we have 8 stanzas, and what he's trying to create is the daily feelings of anxiety, frustration and confusion. It's a daily experience, so each stanza feels the same, each day feels the same. We're asking the question, what are we doing here? So Owen structured the poem to show that life as a soldier was not all heroic, it was not all action, it was often anticlimactic. Stanzas begin with a blunt and powerful sentence, include emotive language to build tension and suspense and curiosity for the reader, and then concludes with an anticlimax. The final line of each stanza is an anticlimax. It doesn't fit with the rest of the sentences. But, however, the structure is consistent, so every stanza is the same structure. Soldiers are highly stressed out, as if an attack is going to happen at any moment, so they're constantly aware, they're constantly nearly paranoid, and the poem is trying, in a structure sense, to convey how it feels to wait for action, how it feels to wait to die. And that's a really interesting point as well, is this idea of waiting for death, knowing you could die, and the effects of to be in this constant state of wartime action time. It's like you don't really understand the psychological effects of being in a constant state of stress. You might hear soldiers talk about how all we cared about was getting our guys out of there, and we weren't thinking about the political aspect. All we care about is surviving. Well, that's exactly it. They're just existing. But we, from the outside, know the political side, so we have to answer that question too. In terms of rhyme, the poem follows a consistent structure as well. A, B, B, A, C. That's our rhyme scheme. First and the fourth lines rhyme, the second and the third lines rhyme, and the final line is irregular, but it's consistently irregular. So it's that same idea of building us towards the anticlimax. Wilfred Owen uses what I like to call para-rhyme. So he has consonants but not vowels including in the rhymes. And we'll just go to the first stanza we'll look at it. It says nivus, nervous, silent, salient at the end of the first 4 lines. And what we're seeing there is essentially half rhymes. They're incomplete rhymes. And for a reader, you're maybe guessing, I'm expecting the poem to be, it looks like the poem is going to be our traditional stanza poem with a consistent end rhyme scheme. But it's not the case. So it's like you're almost depriving the reader of full rhymes, the same way soldiers are being deprived of the action that they expected. There's also the use of caesura in some sentence structures, which is punctuation that makes us stop and pause in the middle of a sentence. So you see some colons and some commas and full stops in the middle of sentences. It just kind of keeps the reader off balance, keeps the poem off balance, and just kind of denies that satisfaction of a free-flowing poem. Takes away the musical quality. So we're looking at maybe why. Why is he doing this? What's the reasoning behind this? And one point I want to add in here is an idea around intertextuality. And what that is when a writer links to another text or links to another poem or another writer's idea. And the poet he's linking to here is John Keats, a romantic poet. John Keats wrote Ode to a Nightingale, which you may have studied in year 9. And where 2 of these poems are quite similar is in the use of assonance, the use of the 8 stanzas, the use of personification and beautifully crafted language techniques, and also similar ideas, especially with nature. They both open as well quite similarly. John Keats opens Nightingale with "My heart aches." Wilfred Owen opens his poem here, Exposure, with "Our brains ache." So we have that opening line, and they're both dealing with nature, except for John Keats is talking about how nature, my heart aches, it's so beautiful out here. Whereas Wilfred Owen said, my brain aches because the weather conditions are horrendous and they're more deadly than bullets. That's a simple idea that, Wilfred Owen's trying to expose the dangers of nature. And that's a beautiful paragraph you can write, linking with language techniques and talking about how the weather is more dangerous than bullets. But we can even go further than that. And if we want to really improve our structure and form, we're saying that he's paying homage to John Keats as well in terms of structure and form, suggesting maybe that he's going to use 8 stanzas, but he's not going to use full rhyme. And it's kind of coming to the idea that poems need to be written in a certain way, but they also need to have a certain issue. So he's taking away this idea of being romantic with the world and reflective and seeing the beauty in everything, and he's just talking about an issue. And he's using his platform with the poem to talk about that issue. He uses essentially what we expect the poem to be, but in reality there's subtle changes that change it completely. So that's all I would say for AO2. Just linking back to AO1, we're talking about exposure of lies, exposure of the truths, exposure of the realities. In terms of what else I could say about the poem, I'm sure there's lots more I could say. I suppose the last thing we're going to say about structure and form, you're going to say he's deliberately doing this. You're going to identify all of that. You're going to say it's deliberately used, and to do that we're linking them with our intertextuality, so that Owen is deliberately using language, structure and form to create the effect of feeling empathy, questioning the war and exposing the realities for life as a soldier. And that's kind of the key point, just World War I in terms of facts, because you're wondering then, what's it all for? Well, at the end of this war, because of that assassination and the alliances and what happened afterwards, and America got involved too, Essentially, we ended up with a war that killed 9 million soldiers, 21 wounded soldiers, and wounded is vague. Wounded could be a graze of a bullet or, a blown off leg. And 10 million dead civilians, so more dead civilians than soldiers. Also, we have the idea that in 1918 we had a flu pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic. Oh, look at that, so relevant. Wow, amazing. 20 million dead there, potentially 50 million dead. And then you also have the fact that all the empires fell apart after the war, and that essentially Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini, all these right-wing nationalist groups, rose in power in the 1930s. So the resolution was never found in the war. So the question is never answered properly, because they go back for another war. And I think Wilfred Owen tries to capture a bit of that confusion as to why soldiers are fighting wars for political reasons. So that's really it. We started on this journey with the interview. I'm going to just finish it with a song. And this song, in my eyes, just represents the difference between soldiers, expectations, and realities.
If you want to find the quartermaster, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the quartermaster, I know where he is. He's drinking up the company rum. I saw him drinking up the company rum. I saw him drinking up the company rum. If you want to find a battalion, I know where they are. I know where they are. I know where they are. If you want to find a battalion, I know where they are. They're hanging on the old barbed wire. I saw them hanging on the old barbed wire. I saw them hanging on the old barbed wire.
That's a wrap. Yes.